Poetry with me, Grace.
Me, Charlotte.
And me, Karen.
Woo! We have some guests today that, we just found around campus who are here to help us with our project.
I'm Moira.
I'm Joanna.
And I'm Ruby May.
Yes, okay, and so we are doing this project to kind of talk about language and poetry and how they can serve as a bridge to new ideas and connections. Through our class, we've noticed how poetry can engage with the reader to draw out new ideas. We learned about Dr. Rafael Campo, a doctor who prescribed his patients' poems. And having engaged deeply with a variety of contemporary poets, we hope to make our new knowledge accessible to those around us. Our goal is to address the current states of our peers and see if poetry can work to help them redefine and recognize their emotions, and also maybe encourage them to look into all that contemporary poetry offers.
We wanted to start by asking our guests about their experiences with poetry and how their perception of poetry changes when we talk about contemporary poetry. So, Ruby May, you're on the spot. What do you think of when you think of poetry?
I generally think of, old poetry. So Shakespeare is the first poet that comes to mind. And every kind of instance I've had learning poetry is reading, like Alfred Lord Tennyson and just older poets for, AP language classes and that kind of thing. With contemporary poetry, the only thing I've really engaged with is, bad contemporary poetry. When Gabby Hanna came out with her book. I watched a lot of videos about why this is bad. I don't think I've ever actually seen any good contemporary poetry.
That'll change today.
Yeah.
Moira, what's your experience with poetry, contemporary poetry?
I read poetry in high school for English classes. We did a poem of the week. I kind of got into contemporary poetry during the pandemic. People were doing a lot of virtual poetry readings and stuff. But I was looking back at some of the stuff that I had written down, and I was like, this is all really, really depressing. So I think when I think of poetry, I think of people dealing with heavy emotions and processing stuff through art.
Yeah.
That's really cool that you were able to reach out and kind of connect with it in your own sense, though. Do you feel at all that you were encouraged by teachers in high school to do that on your own, or was that more just, in the pandemic or trying to find a hobby or...
Yeah, I had one really great teacher for junior year who was super big on poetry, so she would send us stuff. And that was a great resource during the pandemic. She would kind of direct us to new poets that she wanted us to explore.
That's really cool. I feel like I've never heard anybody say that about their high school teacher. It's kind of very distilled. So that's really cool, and I'm happy that you got to have that experience. And then Joanna, how about you?
Honestly, when I think of poetry, I think of rhymes and 575 haikus and stuff like that.
Classic.
That's just base knowledge, but I feel like Moira said, I think a lot of it is just people processing emotions. I feel I don't know, the only poem that I really remember from high school, I don't even remember the name, but it was an Edgar Allan Poe poem. And it was around Halloween, and my English teacher was we have to read this poem, and she made us act it out. So that's really my experience of poetry. Not that great.
Yeah. Poe's a cool dude,
yeah.
but still an old white guy.
Yeah.
So it still kind of buys into something that we've talked about, how there's almost a very standardized practice when it comes to poetry. It's almost a unit that you introduce, nobody wants to do it, you kind of get it out of the way, and then you're done with it forever. And I don't know about Charlotte and Grace, but I've kind of had a similar experience in high school. So I felt like contemporary poetry, I haven't really heard about it, honestly, until college. I don't know about you guys. But being able to read it and seeing different types of poets was really interesting, and something that we looked at a lot in this class. And we have a lot of them presented here for you. But first, something we kind of wanted to talk about is where are you guys at right now? The big idea of this project and our main goal is to find a way for you to connect to the poetry. We don't want it to be something you just read and turn to the next page. You know, we want it to present something for you to think about or something that you can relate to. So if there's anything particular you guys wanted to bring to the table, you know, I know it's also finals, so the tension's high.
Yes.
So if there's anything in particular that you guys had on the top of your minds that we could try to pull from and prepare some poems for you, then that'd be really cool. So does anyone want to go first?
I can start.
Okay, thank
Yes.
you, Ruby.
Yes.
Go,
Yeah.
Ruby.
So one of the things that's really present for me is really struggling to like figure out what I want to do with my life and settle like on something. I just declared a major, which is English. by the way. But it's still like I don't know where I'm going with that. I'm like trying to come up with like a career path now that I've actually declared something. That's just I'm at a complete loss, and there's a lot of like uncertainty and feeling like I don't know, like everybody else has their lives figured out, and I'm still kind of in this like transition period that I feel like I've been in for literally years.
Yeah.
So.
I would just say, I think a poem that really connects to that and this idea of, you know, kind of modernizing language and poetry and how we see it as, is a poem by John Murillo, who we loved. But it's called Contemporary American Poetry, and I think he, in the poem, you know, kind of discusses a lot of these ideas of what it means to, like, find purpose and if what we're doing is enough. So I'll read that for everyone. So Contemporary American Poetry. Another Monday, and you're out with some poets, one of whom, maybe you, has just given a reading, and it's summer and it's Brooklyn, or it's the Village and it's winter, and you've landed at some dusty dive bar, crowded around an 8-top to order wings, shots, and whatnot, when, halfway down the table, you hear one poet congratulate a second on some prize, or another, while a third sulks, sips his gimlet, and pretends not to listen, and a fourth mumbles something about not being notified his application was even received, and how you have to be gay or black or both to win anything these days. And a fifth poet pushes a plate of nachos towards you and asks what you think about the state of contemporary American poetry, and before you can answer, a sixth pries in, mishearing, of course, the last few syllables, and waxes cerebral, something about dawn share, or plowshares, or maybe even timeshares, and on the television mounted, hanging overhead, an anchorwoman's mouthing the muted news of another boy, shot dead and black in some city, now burning, and the police chief promises a thorough investigation, and a Yemeni woman is burning, splashed with acid for loving who she chooses, and everywhere you think is burning, burning, and yes, you hear a graduate student quip between slurps about a newly dead master. I tried to like his work, may he rest in peace, but try as I might, I found him too accessible. Another Monday, and it's summer in Brooklyn, or it's the Village in winter. You're with the poets, one of whom, the political poet, the outsider poet, has brought along a selfie stick. You put your shot glass to your mouth. What's inside is burning, burning. Everybody now, squeeze in tight. Everybody now, say cheese. Yeah.
That was
you.
really beautifully read. And
Thank you.
Ruby, as another new English major, and Ruby and I have talked about things like this before. And one poem, when I was reading, I thought about that same dilemma, is Every Unbearable Thing by Tashani Doshi. And I think that in this poem, and I don't want to say what I think it is or try to divide it into anything because I feel like it holds so many multitudes, but the idea of like naming our desires and figuring out what we want and seeing how things can have hurt and can have helpfulness in it together, I thought was really prevalent in here. And there was just so many different passages that I feel like you could take out of context and apply it to different facets of your life. And even if the theme isn't the same as what you're speaking of, I think that there are portions in here that can be meaningful to anyone. So, say you began as a rib or a clod of earth. Say you were blossoming until someone stared too long at your shirt and leaned in, unbuttoned, pushed, forced. Don't mistake me. This is not a poem against slogging, but against the kind of one-way desire that herds you into a dead-end alley. and how this can lead to a weakened epidermis and despair and nights of howling, and whom can you tell except mother, friend, cat, while sky keeps on being sky and streets filled with danger. Say you survive and mostly you're okay, because turns out you can carry cauldrons of hurt, and your heart is as strong as a giant carbon atom. Say you gather sisters and tell one another legends about when women were keepers of the universe, when gardens proliferated between our thighs, and even if we were hacked and scattered over the earth, temples would grow from the bits of us. Even the cosmos. Seriously, the cosmos stemmed from us. In other words, we were the beginning, the origin of the world. Say all this has vanished, like the great ox, those awkward flightless birds mistaken for witches. Say those legends have gone into a kind of extinction, and we have grown silent as an underground stream. And every now and again, one of us would amass enough steam to plunge off a cliff, like a waterfall shouting a name, and even though the noise she made was thunderous, nobody heard, and she disappeared, and we did not ask where she went to or why. Heart, atom, danger, once not to break apart. And it is hard to say where our ears and tongues went off to be pilgrims in the valley of silence without leaving a note, or how thorns got plucked from our throats, but now they've returned. We must make up the beds and unpack the cases. We must listen to every unbearable thing until we too can name our unbearable things, until the sound of unbearable is deafening. And it is like the fairy tale after a long spell of sleep. It is to wake up, people. It is time to find our way back. Bridges are burning and towers have collapsed, and some will say the witches are returning. But really, it is the world asking us to be made again. So let us bring flowers, let us bow down, let us worship and reveal our scars. Let us.
Ooh, that was beautiful.
It reminds me of Ruby.
I was gonna say, it's really cool how both of the poems you guys happened to pick had elements of burning too. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just really fun coincidence.
Yeah.
Maybe not a coincidence, I
Yeah.
don't know.
Ooh.
Save a plot.
Yeah. One line that stuck out to me in Charlotte's reading, thank you again for reading that, Charlotte, was this line that says, turns out you can hold a cauldron's worth of hurt. And I feel like that kind of relates to what you were talking about, how this, almost void of isolation, but also find it kind of aimlessly walking and trying to figure things out at such a interesting age to be alive, post-pandemic, in university, 18 to 22, what have you. So this idea of collecting your hurt and pain in this cauldron and not realizing how deep it is, I feel like can be something that is pretty universal around this table.
Yeah.
So it's really cool.
I also thought one thing that stuck out to me in that poem is the idea of naming your desires, because I know, Ruby, you're so passionate about so many things, and you're so good at so many things that part of the trouble of naming a major is defining it. But I hope that you found some power in naming it.
It did.
Yes. Fist bump.
Yeah. Was there anything else that came to your mind specifically from hearing those poems?
Definitely in the second one, the kind of implication of gender too was really interesting. I really liked the part where it was like, I don't remember the words exactly, but like we birthed the universe or something like that, or like we made it. Well, it didn't say birthed, but it said created. I don't know. It was just like there was something interesting there that was like I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, and then in that topic of gender, because this table, obviously you can't see us, but it's it's all women at this table, and we were talking about how, in this one line, talking about the thorns of the throat, and talking about naming desires, like Charlotte brought up, as a woman in society, there's been a lot of progress, obviously, but there's still a lot of implications toward being quiet or passive or self-contained, and that can be really difficult. So I don't know if that's something that you guys would feel comfortable talking about, your experiences in gender identity in the 21st century, negatives, positives, stuff like that. I'm gonna turn it to Joanna. Do you have anything specific
with dealing with gender?
Yeah, or just in general, anything.
Honestly, I was just, when you started talking about that, I'm an applied psych major, and before that I was an elementary ed major, and I feel like a lot of that world is very women-centered, and I feel like that is something that's very empowering. I feel like just being in a class with like all women and being able to like just bond over like an academic field is very nice, and it's very uplifting, but I also think in that I feel like it's important to encourage like everyone to like join the field. I think that it's not just a women field, and I feel like it's professionals like that. I feel like it's needed, and so I feel like just expanding that. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny when you say that because obviously I would also find it extremely empowering if I walk into a workplace and saw mainly women, because I feel like that brings a different sense of vulnerability into the table, and I feel like conversations can be held more authentically in that type of atmosphere. But it's also, I don't want to call it ironic, but it's a little bit toxic too, because with something like teaching or being a child psychologist or whatever, it is seen as an occupation that holds a lot of nurturing. So I feel like that's why a lot of people still see it as like a women-driven field. But it's really great that you were able to bring up that it is empowering still, beside that sense of limitation based off of the societal outlook on it, which is cool. And it kind of reminds me of another poem also by Doshi, and this is called The Comeback of Speedos. I'll keep this brief. I remember the shock of Mr. G's tiger-striped trunks at the Madras Kamgaka Club. Nothing to conceal, everything to declare. Like a Mills and Boone hero. Shiver of ball and sack, acres of hairy scrub. We could not imagine such freedom for ourselves. To slice through chlorinated depths with a little basket of dim sum on display. We were girls. To open our legs was treason. We held our breath. And you can't see it, people listening, but it's in the shape of a Speedo. So obviously, you know, there's lines like the shiver of ball and sack and stuff like that add a lot of humorous elements to it. But then it ends on such striking lines. We were girls. To open our legs was treason. And kind of just also goes into that supplement of women having to be concealed physically and emotionally.
Yeah. I would say, going off of that, Moira, our guest here, is actually my roommate, and I had her, she came during the Karen Schofield visit, and she actually read the collection. We had some great conversations about it, and I feel like that might kind of relate to this discussion of gender, if you maybe want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I had read some of the Karen Schofield ones. I like the Speedo one. I think it's really funny. And I know that
you have your friend in college is in ROTC, I think, and Karen Schofield writes a lot about what it's like to be a woman in the military and how those gender dynamics can be really difficult to navigate, especially when there's, you know, not necessarily that same support that maybe women in education or in different fields have.
Yeah, it was interesting reading those poems because it's really like the opposite of like the supportive, nurturing spaces that we were just talking about.
Yeah.
And she talks so much about how there's such masculine spaces and so male dominated. And there was one poem about like how like women becoming like men in this space, like something about throwing a grenade. And it reminded me of what my friend who is in an ROTC program, so like not the military but still a similar culture, talked about, just like it's a very gendered space, it's a very male dominated space, and just like the gendered language that people use, the like sexualized language that people use, like when talking to each other, like even like low-key like homoeroticism, because it's like such a male-dominated space, and like that coming out in like some toxic ways too, like because it's also such a violence like centered space. But I thought that I enjoyed reading some of Karen's poems because some of them are really funny and some of them still have like the humor aspect, more like the Speedo one, but then other ones are like very serious. Like I didn't find the throwing gap like that funny at all. And it was just interesting, like, those shifts in tone, too,
Yeah.
with her experience.
Do you think it was maybe, like, able to help you kind of think about, the experiences that your friend kind of is going through and, like, reevaluate certain aspects of your thinking, I guess?
Yeah, it was interesting because I feel like when she talks about it, it's usually from a humorous standpoint. Mm-hmm. So it's usually like, let me tell you this crazy thing that happened like at PT this morning. But then I feel like Karen Schofield, like, in writing is able to go, like, a little deeper, maybe. Like, yeah, some of the subtext of, like, these hilarious incidents. It's like, I can't really imagine living that life, like, all the time.
Yeah.
One poem that really reminds me of what you're saying is Army Smart Book, Small Arms Fire May Sound Like Mosquitoes. When I read this one, I laughed out loud, and then by the end of it, I was not laughing out loud. And it's pretty short, too. It's on page 23, but it says, "Then those are the scariest fucking mosquitoes ever. Mosquitoes. Who told you that? Some writer? Mosquitoes big enough to carry off your soul. Mosquitoes the size of a dinner plate, size of an exit wound. People who say mosquitoes are back troops hearing it in the distance. It's the patrols outside the wire that worry about your mosquitoes. I'd call it more hornet or jacket zipper. Crack hiss, someone pissing in his pants. A man snapping his fingers as if he wanted you to look at him." I think that the change between turning the title upon its head and going against that Army Smart Book and what's expected of her and expected of any soldier, to a man snapping his fingers as if he wanted you to look at him, which resonates throughout a lot of her other poems, and that change between being able to see how what's told isn't what's true, and then seeing how the unspoken can have even greater resonance than what's supposed to be instructed.
Very true, very true.
And I know, not to put you on the spot again, Ruby, but Ruby's my RA, and she, surprise, and she's also in charge of the Women's LLC in Kotska. And I know you just recently handed out a book to your residents.
I did.
How do you feel about the power of literature in the space of feminism and how words can shape our ideas?
I think one of the things I notice a lot, I'm also a women and gender studies minor, and I do a lot of, like, I read a lot of feminist literature. And one of the things I notice a lot is how, like, of even, like, a specific word, like, that might seem like two different things can, or like mean the same thing, can drastically change. So one of the things that really bugs me about the book that I just recently passed out.
The book?
It is a essay, kind of transcript based on a TED Talk called "We Should All Be Feminists." The TED Talk was fairly, it was a fairly good summary of feminism, but kind of one that is not designed for a higher level of thinking about feminism, in my opinion. It's designed for people who think feminism is not for them. And so I had some difficulty because at one part of the essay, she says, the author says, men and women are biologically different. Women can have children, men can't. And that's not quite true. The better, like, word would be males and females are biologically different, because that is, like, a psychological and biological truth. But sex is separated from gender, and you get into constant difficulties with that, and it's a very nuanced subject. And so that's one of the things, I don't know if I'm kind of moving away from the point a little bit, but with literature that I see too is it, like, comes down to a very nitty-gritty point, and what you say can sometimes be completely changed based on, like, the context that you're saying it in, or what you're trying to get across. That's one thing I find really interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and that kind of goes back to our open conversation that we've been having with Schofield, because something that Schofield has been interested in is, like, etiology of words, and she talks about the origins of words and uses them in a lot of her titles, and kind of talks about how it really delineates from what can be deemed as, like, the rawest of the truth. And I feel like that also shows a difference between essayists and poets, because there is a certain amount of fact behind every sentence that ends with a period when it comes to an essay. Whereas poetry, it is so estranged from literature, at least I find in our 21st century thinking. A lot of people see poetry as something that has to have all of this extreme, radical symbolism behind it, but it really can just be boiled down to what's there. But there is ambiguity behind it, and a lot of people find it liberating to have that ambiguity, and a lot of people happen to find it very frustrating. So I feel like this is also part of the goal that we have with building this connection with people. How do we navigate this space, and how do we pull what we need from poetry too? Because it is very self-serving when you're reading it, as opposed to an essay or a book that you would read for class. So that actually just reminded me of a poem from Schofield with that title I was just telling you about. So this poem is called Discharge, origin, Latin, to run away. Not quite the opposite of charge, but close enough. Backpedal, adrift toward the door. 6 weeks in a wake-up. Sign this form. What the Army lets you keep. BDU cap, t-shirts. The shoe shine kit was always yours, as is the flask. Unroll the sleeves, unshine the boots, razor the name tag stitches, remove the rank. If male, consider a whole new pattern of facial hair. If female, an afro, goddess braids, hair that won't be contained, or its opposite. Slick skin, buzz cut, butch. Tattoo on the neck or knuckles, thinking about it. What's done may be undone. See the doctor, see the dentist, have that tooth pulled, accept the college brochures. Take the aptitude tests, fill in the bubbles. Can you write? Can you subtract? Divide what remains. Drive for long hours. Love the smell of the motor pool. Get along with others. Do you escalate or de-escalate? Scare when fireworks. Sit with back to the wall, avoiding crowds, avoid intimacy. Feel the tinder inside. Strike the match. Have a place to go. If hometown, where? If family, if bank account, if bus ticket. Keep the duffel bag. Keep the cap pulled low. At first, anyone stepping into sunshine will say it's too bright. So this poem is directly addressing the difficulties of coming back from duty in the United States military in particular, and how trying to reintegrate oneself into society that you are so estranged from is extremely frustrating, especially without the proper resourcing. And then that title, talking about running away or escaping, it's challenging, where are you running to? What are you running from in these relations? And I feel like that almost goes back to what we were talking about in the way beginning with what you said, Ruby, talking about trying to navigate a space and trying to figure out career goals and post-graduation plans and everything like that. So yeah, I think that just, language is tricky. It's frustrating, but it also can be very liberating, and there is a lot that you can learn to take out of poetry. So I don't know, I just think that's really interesting to talk about too. Yeah. The table.
I cannot hear about Latin and not talk about Latin.
Yeah.
It's a terrible flaw. But I was thinking about how the word that she's referencing that it comes from is disketto, which not only means to go away, but it means to fall apart and to break. And that reminds me of the way you're talking about distance. And recently, it was a discovery, even though it's always been in front of me, I realized how desire comes from de sidus, which literally means down from the stars.
That's so pretty.
I know! That's what I thought. I thought how it goes back to all these mythological ideas of gods and wishing for something. And to me, that puts a distance in lust that I don't feel like we commonly see in poetry. I've been thinking about Ocean Vuong, and there's a quote from A Little Closer to the Edge that says, show me how ruin makes a home out of hip bones. And I feel like there's an intimacy in the poems that we've read and in poetry in general that puts us really close to desire and inside of the minds of these poets, and also in some ways forces us into the minds of ourselves.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering what people are thinking about how you guys maybe who haven't maybe studied poetry the way that we have this semester, how close do you feel to poetry? How when you're reading, do you feel like it's something internal or external, if that makes any sense?
Yeah.
I feel like it's very internal. I feel like in the sense of like I've never actually read a lot of poetry, but I've listened to a lot of poetry and recited it. And I just was really into spoken word poetry because I feel like it gets to like you said, like just people's inner desires and like inner thoughts. And I feel like through that you feel it like within yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say I think I kind of separate myself from poetry a little more. I think I tend to think of the author a lot when I'm reading poetry, like more so than when I'm reading like fiction or like prose. And I know I've had English teachers who are always like, you can't assume the author is the speaker, but I feel like so many poets like really do draw on like their personal experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I think about like when I'm reading poetry.
I had a lot of trouble with that when reading John Murillo and reading Dolores Maybe, because that's one of my favorite poems of the entire collection. The entire time I was like, you asshole. The way that he talks about Dolores, which for everyone else's context, he's talking about a girl who died by suicide, and he doesn't remember her name, he just remembers the conversation, and he's trying to piece her together through the framework of himself, if that makes sense. And I was like, what gives you the right to name her? Then I was like, calm down. Like, this is a persona, perhaps. Like, this isn't John Murillo. You need to stop judging him as a person for the way that he's writing. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that poem, and there's a lot of truth about the way that we view the world, because sometimes we put ourselves into other people's pain, and I think that's part of the poem part of the point of poetry is pulling that pain out of ourselves and either putting it onto someone else or even being able to recognize how we feel through someone else's words.
It's because we almost see it. I had the same trouble, obviously, with the speaker versus author, and we almost are quick to judge it as deflection, or if it's not self-serving in that way. And it's like, what's this person trying to navigate on the page, and what is their word saying about them? And I feel like that's also what can create some distance between poets and readers and just reception in general, which is cool.
I know, and I can't remember which poet it was, but one of our visiting poets, I remember, said something about how she hadn't known that you could, like, quote unquote, lie when writing poetry.
I think it was Johnny Doshi.
Yeah, okay, it might have been.
Yeah.
And how until she was like 25, she did not know, that was an option to do while writing. And I found that really fascinating because we in class discussed so much how, to create distance and if like drawing upon personal experience, and it made me curious to about how her poetry had shifted, I think, after she unlocked that as an opportunity. But yeah.
That gets back to like the Ars Poetica of it all. I've been thinking about that as you guys are talking.
And I think we have so much more that we could say and so much to talk about, but I think our time is running out. If anybody has any last words, anything they want to say, feel free. But
or tell us a little debrief, how does this conversation make you feel differently? Do you feel more inclined to look into poetry, or do you feel like contemporary poetry is a little bit more at the forefront of the brain now, knowing that it is more accessible? Or, do you see poetry being implemented in your own life as a hobby, or just, maybe giving some emotional relief for relativity? Or, I don't know, just give us your thoughts. Something.
I want to take this class.
I want to take it again.
I might study your books for winter break.
All yours.
Yeah.
Do you have any favorites, like points to the conversation? Like, what are you thinking about right now, Ruby?
I'm thinking about that one book. The pretty one.
Oh, I could do any of them. This
That
one?
one.
Oh, God, sure.
Yeah. I want to steal that from you.
All yours.
Yeah, I love that all the poem or the poetry that you read was like so different, like the different collections. Yeah, and that's so cool because I think like you tend to see poets as like dead people. So it's like So it's
Old
so cool
white
that like
guys.
there's like so many people like still making stuff. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's interesting to see like the flaws in that people. Like, didn't Edgar Allan Poe have like a 13-year-old wife or something? Like, I swear that's a thing.
Probably.
Because I've been thinking about this entire conversation.
If not his cousin, then yes.
I think it was both.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it
Oh,
was.
His cousin
God.
was also 14.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Or I'm making that up. But just like,
Yeah.
that goes back to our point. Like, writers can be flawed. We can still appreciate it, which is a big conversation and a big declaration for me to make. But I still think, I feel like we found some beautiful things during this conversation, and I'm grateful that it's happened.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, thank you all so much for taking the time
Yeah.
to do this during finals. I know it's busy. And I hope everybody leaves this conversation, you know, with some newfound knowledge on contemporary poetry and hopefully maybe with a willingness to share this newfound knowledge with other friends, family members. Yeah.
I'm gonna go corner my other roommate.
Yes. And my mom might get some poetry there.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Okay, thank you
Okay.
so much, guys.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.